Hello, if you're just joining us now, we're going to give it a few more minutes as per usual in order to let a few more people arrive. So just bear with us for one moment and hopefully we'll have a few more people join us.
Does actually say that there are 26 participants, James?
Yeah, we've got people, 22 people so far. So we'll have a couple more people arrive in the next couple of minutes and then we'll get started. Just so you know, we will be taking questions at the end of the webinar. So if you would like to submit a question, what you can do is type in the question and answer box. So if you've got any now that you might have, you're welcome to start typing them in or just wait until the end or throughout the whole thing if you've got a question that comes up. Just so you know, we're going to mainly be focusing on broader picture issues and sort of the whole idea of the planning reforms, what's going to change, rather than particular developments. So if you've got a development specific question, this might not be the time to ask it, just because we won't have that information on hand. Okay, so just to make you aware, that is the case. So what time are we on? 1, 2. And you are welcome to use the chat box as well as we go through, if you want to discuss things with the people. We've also got 2 of our staff members on hand as well to perhaps post the links out to you with our campaign information and campaign sign up links. So that will be going on as well. Up to 25, so this is good. One more minute and then we'll start. Oops, that's not good just yet. It's really nice to see that we've had quite good uptake with this as well. Okay, so I think I'll start running through all the housekeeping and then we'll be able to go on to talking about planning for nature and what we're campaigning for as a trust. So just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and you'll be able to watch this later if you want to revisit anything at any point. Don't worry, none of you are being recorded, it's just Rachel and me, it's just us two. So you don't need to worry about that. We're also going to be taking questions at the end of this. I just said this before, but I'll say it again. We're not going to be talking about specific planning applications or particular sites. We're going to be talking about the broader reforms that are going on at the moment and potential changes that we're going to see in the planning system. So this isn't the time to ask about specific developments just because we don't have that information on hand. What we will be doing is taking questions at the end. So if you've got questions throughout the webinar, what you'll be able to do is submit them. And we'll revisit them at the end. We aren't ignoring you, we will come back to them. And you're welcome to wait until the end to submit them as well. So there should be a question and answer box on the bottom of your screen. I think it's the 4th one in, where you can send them in and we can have a look at those later on. Right, let's get cracking then. To introduce myself quickly, I'm James and I'm a campaigns officer for Cheshire Wildlife Trust. So I'm responsible for meeting a lot of our MPs, our councils, and also getting the public involved with the work we're doing in terms of our campaigns. Joining me today is Dr. Rachel Giles, so she's our evidence and planning manager. Rachel, would you like to just quickly introduce your role?
Yeah, James, I'm Rachel, and I've worked for the Cheshire Wildlife Trust for about 10 years. My team is responsible for looking after the local wildlife site system in Cheshire, and we also do lots of planning responses. I'm quite involved with HS2 at the moment, but we also talk to local authorities a lot, so we advise them on things like biodiversity net gain, all that kind of thing. So yeah, that's sort of summary of my role.
Okay, so let's get started. So I wanted to start off today, I'll just quickly exit this, by just showing you a quick video. Let me just share on the screen. So last year we launched our Wind in the Willows trailer. So some of you may have seen this already, but I think it sort of nicely sort of sets the tone for developments. And let me just check we've got the right sounds on. No, let's put the sound on. But yeah, it does set the tone for developments and how it is shaping our lives at the moment, our communities and our landscape. So I'll just give that a quick play just to set the tone.
Spring days, my favourites.
Let's see here. There were animals here, I've been told, long before that same city ever came to be.
Since we first met Badger and friends, the UK has become one of the most nature-depleted places on the planet.
We've lost so much.
But we can bring it back.
Hey guys! Sorry I'm late.
It's not too late to save our wildlife, but we must act together.
Spring days.
Cut it short a little bit there. So I did want to just play that there because it really shows how if we don't get development right, it can be absolutely catastrophic for wildlife. And I think we disappointed quite a lot of people with that trailer because they thought there was a film coming out afterwards. But we actually just made that to highlight the need for us to start impacting on national legislation. And this is something the Wildlife Trust have done for years, but it's something that we recognise is even more important now, and particularly in the wake of Brexit, where a lot of our laws are changing and we're going to have to replace a lot of European law. So this planning webinar is going to focus particularly on the reforms that are on their way. And basically it's based on the white paper that's just come out. So the government white paper is basically outlining what the government hopes to do. It's not actually law, it's not legislation, it's just more so like a vision for the future. So what we're going to be talking about today isn't necessarily going to happen, it's just it could happen. And particularly if we don't respond to the consultation, we don't get our voices heard and we don't get our input into that, this could very well be what we're looking at in the future. And as we'll explain, there's a lot of things we really want to change and really want to influence to make sure that nature is put on the agenda. So things that are really sort of prominent in this is the idea of cutting red tape, speeding up developments, increasing the number of houses built and streamlining the whole process. That's what the government wants to do. And there's numerous problems that we can unpick within this because not all of it is good for nature at all. Cutting red tape, a lot of the time, is the red tape is there to potentially protect the environment. And there are certain things we don't want to lose and certain things that we want to keep in place or see strengthened in a way to ensure that we really have that best protection for nature. So although there are many things we could probably talk about here today, we are going to focus on the environmental impacts simply because that's what we do, it's what we know about, and we've got the most knowledge to talk about those. So again, if you've got any questions as we go through the webinar about these reforms or what they might mean for you and your community, please put them in the question and answer box and we'll get to them at the end, and hopefully either Rachel or me will be able to answer them. So what is this new proposal? Well, the idea is that they want to front load the system. Basically, we want to use data to create some big map of all our areas of spaces that could be developed and put them in different categories as to what type of development can appear on those sites. So we're talking about front loading it, or getting most of the legwork and sort of groundwork out of the way early on, and then freeing up the development stage later. So Rachel, perhaps come to you here. Why do we want a data-driven approach? So this is a data-driven approach. We'll talk about why it quite isn't right in a second, but why is a data-driven approach important to start off with?
Yeah, the Wildlife Trust certainly want a data-driven approach. At the moment, planning decisions are taken on data that's it's stored in different places. Different organisations have access to it. Quite a lot of information is just with individuals, and there are lots of problems in the current planning system. Constraints are often flagged at a very late stage in the system because the data isn't there initially, and we think that having lots of data available up front will lead to better decisions. Decisions are only as good as the evidence that they're based upon. So yes, certainly having that information there early on in the process is really important, and especially when it comes to things like strategic planning, so thinking about nature recovery networks. So we need to have that information there. There are lots of resources that we can turn to. So, for example, the local, Cheshire Wildlife Trust leads on the local wildlife site partnership. So this is something that we're kind of really proud of, and that's an incredible source of information. So yeah, it's not perfect though. We've got limited people working on it at the moment.
And in a way, that's kind of part of the problem we have with this, isn't it? In the fact that there aren't the resources there necessarily, and there's not the data there to perhaps make these initial categories and group this land. So one in particular that we deal with, as you said, is the local wildlife sites. And the reality is that a lot of those sites aren't currently designated, are they? There's lots of sites that we don't know about necessarily. Could you perhaps tell me a little bit more about that, so, and how that's problematic in a way for this system?
Yeah, so this new system, it is dependent on having that information there. But what we really need is like a survey of each local authority planning area needs a proper habitat survey. And like you say, James, there's lots of sites that we know are out there that we know are really important for wildlife, but they have no protection whatsoever. And what we're concerned about in these new proposals is that it's all going to be rushed through, and the information that could be fed into it, the timing is all wrong. But we need more time, we need more resources to get those sites recognised in the planning system. And that's one of our main concerns about this new system, is that the time, it's just not going to be enough time to get that system up and running properly as it should be. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got obviously like the councils, they will do some of this surveying, and then we obviously do quite a lot as well, but there's finite resource there. And I think part of the big issue we've got is that we don't have the resources in place to get that data to ensure that we're not missing off local wildlife sites, and we're not missing those out in particular categories. So to talk about these three categories that are going to sort of shape the whole planning process going forward, we first have these, what we call growth zones. So these growth zones are going to be areas on like the outskirts of urban areas that are going to extend urban areas, probably quite substantial developments as they've put it in the paper. So we're potentially talking quite big developments here, major developments, potentially on greenfield sites, former industrial sites. So anything that's going to allow for large scale development, really. And what is this going to mean for nature, essentially, Rachel?
Well, certainly in the current planning system, we do have equivalent to growth zones, so they're the allocated sites. But in the new system, what we think is that it's all going to be speeded up. So they're not going to be looking in great detail at if a site has been allocated, if it's got this outline permission effectively. And having that loss of ability to assess a site for wildlife means it's leads to reduced opportunities to integrate wildlife into developments. So, for example, if you've got a site on the edge of town that has a bit of woodland or a pond, at the moment, the situation is that those areas can be integrated into the scheme. And that's really good, not just for wildlife, but also for people, because it's basically green infrastructure. And green infrastructure obviously is important for quality of life. It helps, gives people access to nature. There's recreation opportunities there, but it also has environmental reasons to incorporate wildlife and green infrastructure. So, for example, it could alleviate from flood risk, or it could provide opportunities for carbon capture and storage, air quality, all of these that are affected by green infrastructure. And certainly, as we mentioned before, there's plenty of sites out there that we know are important for wildlife but have not been designated. So if we have these growth zones and there are undesignated sites that effectively are really important, so they're meeting the local wildlife site criteria, they're at risk of being completely built on at the end of the day. So we're really, really worried about the new proposals for these growth zones. We want nature everywhere, not just in a protect zone or outside of towns and cities. Urban wildlife is just as important.
Yeah, because I think probably what's key to stress within these growth zones is that we're going to have basically automatic outline planning permission. So these sites, once they're designated as a growth zone, they will automatically get the outline planning permission once a developer puts it forward. So we are losing that ability to perhaps influence those developments. And as Rachel was saying, that sometimes on these big sites, we need to consider wider things like green infrastructure, how nature fits in with these big developments, so it's not lost. So that's just a quick overview of those zones. The second of these zones that we're going to be seeing is the renewal zones. Now, this is perhaps a smaller scale development that's going to start taking place within urban areas already. So we're talking about the infilling of small pockets of land within cities and towns that's not currently used. So it might be that it is just a small open space that hasn't yet been developed, or it might be perhaps a brownfield site that was once developed but has since been abandoned, and it might need to be, well, the government are seeing this as an opportunity to regenerate those sites. However, brownfield sites are quite important, aren't they, Rachel, in terms of their value to wildlife? So could you perhaps tell me a little bit more about them and why they are significant?
Yeah, they're really important, James. Obviously, not all brownfield sites are the same. Some are not that great for nature, wildlife, but a lot are really good. And it's because basically they've been abandoned, and it might be that the development sort of 50, 60 years ago, and wildlife has had the opportunity to move back in. And actually, many brownfield sites are better than greenbelt or greenfield sites in terms of the wildlife there. So, for example, there could be things like reptiles. Very often they're very good for invertebrates, bees, butterflies, pollinators, all kinds of things. So yeah, these are really important sites, and some of the most exciting sites as a botanist to go to and visit, because there's all sorts of things grow there. So yeah, I think development on brownfield sites is something we're particularly worried about, and also it's not just about necessarily all the species and that I've mentioned. It's all to do with also to do with connectivity in the landscape, so having them as stepping stones for migration, dispersal, allowing species to move from one site to the next. So brownfield sites are really important, and they're the ones at the end of the day that are most at risk. They're often on the edge of urban areas. It could be species-rich grasslands, orchards, that kind of thing. So yeah, we're quite worried about these.
Yeah, because essentially these are like almost like the last refuge for wildlife in some cities, and we're talking about those last little bits of land, those last wild spaces being lost almost completely. And as we'll talk about later, it's really important that nature is able to move around in order to be, well, for it to thrive, essentially. So this renewal category is potentially problematic with some of those sites that will be of high value to wildlife. So in a way, these two areas, with the growth areas, we're seeing nature is just automatically being discounted, and then these renewal categories is kind of being overwhelmed as well. So there's two different ways that we're losing nature there. So moving on to this last category that's been proposed, it's protect. And protect sounds quite good, but it's a bit of a misnomer really, because it doesn't actually do what it says in a way. So the kind of land that's going to be incorporated into this are our local wildlife sites, nature reserves, internationally recognised sites, greenbelt land as well. So we're going to be seeing lots of different categories put into that, which is great. However, there's no additional protection for these sites. What we're sort of seeing is that these sites are going to be governed by the current planning system. And the reality is that the current planning system has been failing nature. It's not helping it recover. So to suggest that putting these into a protect category governed by the current system is going to help wildlife recover, it just seems a bit at odds with what reality is showing us in a way. And so perhaps you could comment more on that for me then, Rachel.
Yeah, well, certainly the protect zone does not mean legally protected. So local wildlife sites, for example, are not legally protected. They have some level of protection, but it's not a legal protection. And the other big concern we have about this is that with the proposed changes, we think there's going to be less requirement for site survey. So if you're in the protect zone, actually at the end of the day it could be that there's less protection than there is already. And also, if you think about site allocations, if a local planning authority have not reached their housing numbers, they will go to the protect zone potentially for windfall sites. And again, with less requirement for site survey, it could be that the protect zones are actually more vulnerable than they are at the moment.
Yes, it seems almost like the protection is relative, isn't it? It's relative to the other two, which are seeing lower protections in a way. So it's not increased protection, it's just the others are being lowered. So we've got quite a few concerns in terms of those categories for a start, but there's also quite a big impact on local democracy as well. So planning is obviously an issue that shapes our communities. It influences our lives in terms of what we see around our towns, our villages and cities. And in the current system, we do have a number of opportunities to feed back on that. So, Rachel, could you just quickly sort of explain where the public currently has the ability to impact on a development?
Well, impacting on the whole planning system, it's sort of a three-tier approach, if you like. So at the very top is the National Planning Policy Framework. So that is consulted on, so the public can have a say on that. Further down in the food chain, if you like, we have local plans. So these come up with site allocations and also all the planning policies, not just to do with nature protection, environmental issues, but everything. And that is a kind of a key point where the public can input into the planning system. But probably the one that most people are familiar with is the site-specific points at which a development comes forward and it's consulted upon. So the details get put on the local planning authority website, or get an office, if it's a library or a town hall, and that is really probably the main way that people do engage with the planning system at the moment. If there's an application close to where somebody lives, they might obviously will take an interest in that, and they have the ability to object to it if they so want. And it's the same with organisations like ours. We also participate in the system at every single level, and certainly at the lower level, the bottom rung, if you like, a site-specific point of consultation. That's where we have a lot of input, and we certainly managed to get a lot of things changed as well. So that's what currently happens.
So yeah, as Rachel's saying there, it's not just the ability for the public to input into developments as well, it's the ability for organisations like Cheshire Wildlife Trust to feed back. And a lot of the work Rachel does is involved in responding to those applications. And what we're seeing is, under these proposed reforms, a complete change in the way that process works. So we talked about how it's front-loading the system and trying to get as much of the consultation out the way at the start, and that sort of does apply for the public really as well. So the public will have a say and an input into the creation of our local plans, so that'll be deciding which parcels of land fit into which category. They'll be able to put forward suggestions to help draw that up. However, what we're going to see is a removal of the public consultation from the actual site-specific side. So that'll stop people almost having an input, really, won't it, Rachel, into the actual development itself?
Yeah, it's really worrying. It seems anti-democratic, really, and not only is it going, or it's not set in stone yet, but the proposals are to take away the ability to respond at that development stage, but it might even take away the ability at a higher level when local plans go to the examiner. We think at the moment those can be challenged, so we've appeared at inquiries over the local plan, but it's possible that that route might even be taken away. But certainly, as far as we're concerned, and I think most of the general public are concerned, is the potential of taking away that ability to object to planning proposals in your locality. And even though we want the system to be front loaded, we don't want that point of consultation to be removed. So we're very concerned about it. Yes, and like I say, it's basically anti-democratic, and yeah, it is worrying.
So I think what we find out is that people mostly become energised and interested in planning when they see how it impacts on their area. So when you start seeing that field you perhaps pass on the way to work or at the back of your house, it's when you know what is going to change in your community that people become interested in planning. And without that sort of consultation point there at that level, it's really going to sort of disenfranchise quite a lot of people, because most people aren't necessarily aware of the impacts of the earlier on stuff. So anyway, we've talked a lot about sort of what we think is going wrong with these reforms, and we're perhaps now going to focus on what we can do about it. So as I said at the start, this isn't going to necessarily happen, but it might happen if we don't act now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the wildlife trusts are calling for and how we at the moment have the ability to shape this, because that is a white paper at the moment. That's the vision that's been outlined. We still have the ability to shape that before it comes into legislation. So before it becomes law, we can have an impact on that. So I'm going to talk to you now about what we hope to achieve. And there's really sort of 5 key principles that we're calling for. We want to connect people with nature, so that, like Rachel was talking about at the start, we want nature to be part of everyone's lives. So when we're creating a development, it needs to factor in green space that people can use for recreation and visit. I think we're seeing now more than ever how important that is. With the current pandemic, people need access to green space for their own mental well-being, and that needs to be in planning as well. So we want to involve more people as well. Like we were just saying, the democratic process for people becoming involved in the planning system is really important, because it gives people a say on how the community is developed, and we need that sort of democratic process to be retained throughout this. We want to protect standards, so not just keep standards as they are, we want better standards. If we're going to create this protect category, let's actually protect it, and let's put stronger environmental enforcement in there, so development is restricted on those sites, on our local wildlife sites, nature reserves, greenbelt sites. We need that accurate data again, as we said. Without that accurate data, we're going to get sites going into the wrong category. Local wildlife sites might end up not in the protect category, but in the growth category, where they might automatically get developed on. And then finally, we need nature's recovery to be at the heart of this. So we've long been calling for nature recovery networks to help nature essentially reverse the huge declines we're seeing, and so help it recover. We've got a very exciting proposal that we're putting forward as well with this, called Wild Belt, and we'll just talk a little bit about that as well. But first, I just want to show you what a nature recovery network is. Again, some of you may have seen this video, but it really sort of shows what a nature recovery network is and why it's so important in what we're doing.
My favourite.
Back to that one. So you might recognise the narrative of this. It's definitely been quite prominent in the media at the moment.
A wildlife-rich natural world is vital for our well-being and survival. We need wild places to thrive. Yet many of our systems and laws have failed the natural world. We now live in one of the most nature-depleted places on the planet. Nature urgently needs our help to recover. And it can be done. By joining up wild places and creating more across the UK, we would improve our lives and help nature to flourish. Because everything works better when it's connected. Now is the time to tell our politicians that we need a nature recovery network set in law. A legally binding network for nature would mean that wildlife is prioritised when managing our land and planning our towns. Powerful new environmental laws can ensure habitats are expanded and reconnected, meaning all life will thrive once more. It's time to turn things around. Nature is capable of extraordinary recovery, but we must act now. Tell your politicians, now is the time to put nature into recovery. Everything works better when it's connected.
So I think what's fantastic about that is it just shows how important it is to connect nature. Oh, where's my screen gone? So we need to ensure that nature is joined up, that it is connected. And we'll just talk a little bit more about what those recovery networks are. So just like a transport network, we need it all to be joined up. So Rachel, perhaps you could talk to us a little bit more about nature recovery networks and how they work.
Yeah, what you can see on the screen is a representation of a nature recovery network. And if you can imagine, many years ago, we didn't have fragmented nature. Nature was basically pretty much everywhere. But over the years, particularly the past 60 odd years, it's become very fragmented, and often it's just in small pockets, if you like, scattered across the landscape. And this has not only led to a loss of the ability for species to move through the landscape and feed and breed and disperse, but it's also led to a loss of ecosystem services. So things like the ability to capture carbon, to store carbon, if you think of the loss of woodland, and also things like the air quality. You know, air quality is improved if there's green space around, if there's woodland around. So the situation is pretty dire. But say on the screen, you can see really a study that was done about 10 years ago, and it groups or it represents a nature recovery network in different categories. So you can see there are the big green core areas, and these are things like sites of special scientific interest. They're the local wildlife sites. So they're all the areas that are currently really good for wildlife, and many of them are protected, and these are the really important ones that under the current planning system, hopefully they are protected. And then linking the core areas, you get corridors and stepping stones, and these are the ones that are important for dispersal, for species breeding. If you have populations that are literally stuck in one core area, eventually they will disappear. They've got to be able to move throughout the landscape. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have completely connected habitats. Say stepping stones do perform that function. The next category is the restoration zone. So that's the one at the top. So these are the areas that eventually, hopefully, will become the core areas. So that they're places where habitats restoration or creation is happening, and with the hope of it, say, eventually becoming a core area. And the other little label on there is the sustainable use area. So this is sort of like the matrix that sits behind this. It's everywhere else. So nature doesn't just happen in these core areas and the linkages. It's everywhere, and it's sort of if we are able to. It's called softening the matrix, the term, but if we are able to help wildlife survive everywhere, then that will help and support the different areas in this network. And like James said, these are the components of a nature recovery network.
And we've made quite substantial progress as well with this. So we've got the Environment Bill coming up as well. And as I said at the start, a lot of my role is to lobby our politicians and make sure we are getting what we need out of that for nature in those laws. But then we were quite concerned when we saw these planning reforms that some of the stuff we are campaigning for, like Nature Recovery Network, could potentially be undermined by planning reforms as well. So we've got the Nature Recovery Networks hopefully coming in the Environment Bill, but we need to make sure that the planning system also works to enable those recovery networks. So we're talking in the nature recovery networks, all these different spaces you see on here, like people's gardens, playing fields, parks. It's all those green spaces that we perhaps interact with every day, not just those sites that perhaps we see on the edge of towns. And this has led to a really interesting concept coming from the wildlife trusts, and that is called wild belt. So as Rachel explained, it's really important that we start restoring areas to add to the nature recovery networks and build them up so they're better than they were before. Well, building up is probably a poor term actually, isn't it? But what we're talking about is making sure these areas are allowing nature to thrive. And by introducing wild belt, we're sort of setting aside land, aren't we, Rachel, to allow it to recover and allow it to regenerate itself.
Yeah, I think what we're asking for is that these areas become legally protected. So it enables nature to recover, and it basically protects against future development. And the wild belt areas could be things like environmental land management schemes, particularly the higher level ones, the higher tier. They could also be areas that have had heritage lottery funding, and importantly, they could also be areas where biodiversity net gain is happening. So if you like, it's the offset areas. And if we can have legal protection of these recovery, these restoration areas, that we hope will be what the wild belt is. So
in a way, it's kind of leaving some of the land free from development so it can connect up all those spaces and enable that network to really happen. So we are calling for that as part of the reforms. It isn't currently in the planning white paper, but we hope it will come into the bill when it next arrives in, well, when it first arrives in Parliament, if we get enough people backing it. So at this point, that's mostly what we wanted to talk about today. I hope we've given you a flavour for the reforms. So what we're going to do now is just take questions on perhaps any of those reforms. Again, like I said at the start, we're not focused on particular developments. We're focused on sort of the big picture, the broad reforms. So if you've got any questions for either Rachel or me, please do type them in the question and answer box. So I'll see if we can find that now and then see how many, if we've got some questions, if it'll load up. Oops, let's not go there. Don't know where my box has gone. 1 second. Let's have a look. Okay, so the first question I've received here. I understand that local landowners might be able to provide biodiversity offsetting if development sites cannot achieve biodiversity net gain. Is there a database that landowners can join so they can connect to suitable projects and provide environmental offsetting on their land? So I think that might be one for you, Rachel.
Yeah, there are certainly opportunities for landowners to get involved in this. It's not an easy process. So if you compare it to things like the current environmental land management schemes, doing a biodiversity net gain offset is more onerous, because if it's going to be a legal protection, so there will be consequences, if you like, if landowners don't do what they say that they will. At the moment, there isn't a register, there isn't a database that is going to come. if you are interested in becoming an offset provider, then I suggest you talk to either your local planning authority, or if you want to come and speak to the Wildlife Trust, we can also help you with that. We're looking at doing it on some of our own land, so we do know a fair bit about what's involved. But yeah, it's going to be something that's going to get bigger and bigger, I think, over the next few years. At the moment, it's not mandatory, but when the Environment Bill comes in, which we think is going to be next year sometime, it will be. I think there's a 2-year transition period, so that's probably going to take, it's probably going to be within this current Parliament that it's going to be mandatory. So yeah, do speak to your local authority or planning authority or us.
Okay, so I can't share my screen while I've got the Q&A panel up, so I'll just have to keep it up. But keep your questions coming in as we go along. We might not be able to answer them all, but we'll do the best to go through as many as we can. Under the new white paper, would all land be classified into one of 3 categories, and presumably a set of default development objectives would automatically be applied to each category? And what about existing reserves or wildlife areas not part of the Wildlife Trust organisation? So perhaps to deal with the last part of that first, obviously our reserves are only sort of one part of the land that would fit into the category of protect, and we're talking about internationally recognised sites, local wildlife sites, which we don't necessarily own, and most of the wildlife sites in the area are owned by private landowners, or there's also council land as well. So it's not just affecting our land for that category. We're talking about all sites that are good and valuable for wildlife, even greenbelt, which isn't necessarily good for wildlife, but that would be included in that. But yes, under the white paper, we're talking about all sort of land available for development would be put into one of those 3 categories. And they're talking about having, yes, a set of standards essentially for what these developments should follow. But I think one of the problems we're finding is that it's going to be sort of standardized at a national level rather than a local level. So there might be like local requirements added in, but I think the initial framework is going to be nationally specified. I don't know if you can add anything more to that, Rachel, or want to add anything more?
I think Christine mentioned something about existing reserves or wildlife areas that are not part of our organisation. And certainly if those areas are local wildlife sites, and if they're not local wildlife sites or haven't got any other legal protection, then contact us and we can have a look and to see if they meet the criteria. And if they are meeting the criteria, then that would automatically sort of put them in that protect category. But just want to emphasize it's not a legal protection. It's however, it does give some level of protection within the planning system. Jackie has also asked something linked to that. So she's also asked, can we help in identifying areas for nature? And I'd say definitely yes. If you know areas that you think might meet our local wildlife site criteria, then please do get in contact with us, because we can get stuff into that protect category, if you see what I mean. The criteria are on our website, so just click on it and click on to local wildlife sites and go down there and you'll see the criteria. Obviously it would require a site survey, that kind of thing, but if you are aware of anywhere that you think might meet criteria, just flag it up to us and we can put it on our list. We have a list of potential local wildlife sites where we think the land does meet the criteria, but we haven't actually been out and done a survey, so it's not actually gone through yet. So yes, please do get in contact with us.
Yeah, so what we might be able to do is send out a link just with that information, so you can flag up those areas of land to Rachel and her team. So another question, what do you want us to do in relation to this white paper and by when? I will tell you that in a minute. I'll come back to that one. How different are the implications for wildlife as we leave Europe? So I'll start with that one perhaps. Massive really, because a lot of European law has governed UK law. And what we're having to do now is, with the transition period coming to an end, a lot of those European laws are going to stop having an impact on the UK. And what the UK government said it would do a few years back is that it would basically convert all that European law into UK law. And so we're seeing a huge amount of legislation coming through now. So we're seeing the Environment Bill, the Agriculture Bill, the Fisheries Bill. This is probably going to be a planning bill as well. So that's 4 massive pieces of legislation. Another one that's coming through, National Action Plan on Pesticide Usage and Sustainable Usage of Pesticides. That's coming through later on in the winter. So we're seeing huge environmental impacts, essentially, just, well, in UK law, because those laws need to be converted. And I think the big worry we always have is that in that process for being converted from UK law, EU law to UK law, some of those are going to get dropped, some of those standards, just because they might not make the transition. And so it's important that organisations like us are holding them to account, and we're also helping the public hold politicians to account to make sure those laws aren't weakened. Is there anything you'd like to add on that, Rachel?
I think you basically covered everything, other than it's probably just worth mentioning that so European protected species, they are looking at kind of different ways to mitigate for their loss, and that's partly to do with leaving the EU. We don't know yet whether, because we've not seen all the proposals, whether that's going to be satisfactory. It's already happened for great crested newts, but we've been very much involved in that, the Cheshire Wildlife Trust, so we're confident that it's on the right track anyway. We think that probably is going to be successful, but certainly later, further down the line, there might be other mechanisms to protect other species such as bats or water voles, that kind of thing. So we're just kind of waiting to see, because we don't know if it's going to be as good as existing legislation.
Yeah, so I've not got any more questions coming up other than the one about what I want you to do, which I will talk about. So I'll just give it a couple more seconds. If you've got a question, do put it in now. We're happy to answer it. Like I said, these reforms, they're not set in stone yet, but this is probably what we're going to be looking at without serious changes. So how this is working is we've got the Wildlife Trusts are we are one of like 47 wildlife trusts across the country. So we all talk individually to our local politicians. And then nationally, we have a sort of an overarching trust that is talking to the government directly, essentially, sort of DEFRA. And they're sort of feeding in as much as we can through that way. We're then feeding it through locally. So between the national picture and the local picture, we are really trying to influence all this environmental legislation that is set to go through. So that's what we're looking at, essentially. I've got a couple more questions that have come in there. I've not scrolled down through. Thanks for the question. What constitutes land available for development? Is any land that a developer sees, given that if it's just been... Sorry, I probably put my glasses on, that'd help. Right, what constitutes land available for development? Is it any land that a developer sees, given that if it is seen as suitable, private landowners could see their land compulsory purchased? Do you want to answer that, Rachel? I'm not sure.
Yeah. The only mechanism to compulsory purchase land is really through the bigger infrastructure projects. So something that called NSIPs so these are nationally important infrastructure projects, things like HS2, that has an ability to compulsory purchase land. Certainly for the smaller scale developments, or not even small scale, but housing developments, no, it has to have permission of the landowner. There is no kind of mechanism to, unless the local authority has any ability to influence that. But certainly the onus is on the landowner to put land forward. So most of the land for development is identified at the local planning stage. So that's something we spoke about at the beginning of this seminar. And that's really where the public can come in and respond to those consultations. The other mechanism is the windfall route. So occasionally you have land coming forward that lies outside allocated areas or has not been identified in the local plan. And that's mainly when the local authority hasn't reached it, or is unlikely to reach the housing numbers that they said that they would. That's when that happens. And that does happen quite a lot, actually, and has done in recent years. So, yeah.
I think this is also another one for you, Rachel. Can you explain how biodiversity net gain works? Do you think that this the future developments will be better for wildlife? So just before Rachel answers that, Rachel's kind of like our guru on this. You know so much about it. So over to you.
Well, hopefully. Yeah, so biodiversity net gain, it's a process. It's not just about thinking about how you can offset biodiversity if a site is lost. It's all about applying good practice principles. So when a development comes forward, you need an ecologist to go in there and to make sure the mitigation hierarchy is followed. So the mitigation hierarchy is basically that if there's any important, say, priority habitats on a building site, the very first choice is or the very first route that should be taken is to avoid impacts to those important habitats. If you can't avoid the impacts, then you have to mitigate for the impacts. If you can't mitigate for the impacts as a very, very last resort, then you can offset those impacts. So at the moment, biodiversity net gain, that's coming in to across the country, say in the next couple of years. We're certainly doing it here in Cheshire, and we've been very much involved in that. So what happens if the local planning authority basically says, yes, you can go to that last resort, we're not going to say that you can't chop down that bit of woodland. Then what happens is that the value of that woodland, for example, on a site is measured, and there's a metric that is used to measure the biodiversity value of that woodland. It can't capture everything, so it can't capture species, it can't capture other functions such as ecosystem services, and it's used as a proxy. It's a tool, it's not the be all and end all, it is a tool to put a value on that area of woodland. And then what happens if the damage is offset somewhere else, then you'd have an equivalent area of woodland for your very starting point, and then you'd apply risk factors. So, if you're creating a brand new woodland, clearly it's not going to have much value for the first 50 years. So you'd apply a multiplier. So this is all built into this metric multiplier. And what happens is you end up having to create a much greater area of woodland than you actually lose. And also you can create that woodland in a nature recovery network. So for example, the wildlife trusts, and we're building up to do this now, is to be a habitat provider, so we can go and create that woodland somewhere where it's really important and where it can link with other woodlands. It's not a perfect system, but it's so much better than what we've got at the moment, because what we've got at the moment is basically biodiversity just disappearing off sites and not being valued. So this is, I'm really in favour of this new system, because instead of just being lost or equivalent area being created in a corner of the site, then this is a real mechanism to get biodiversity kind of working again. And the key to think about is the net gain aspect. So if it was biodiversity no net loss, then we'd only replace what is lost. But with biodiversity net gain, we're going beyond what is lost. So if you're losing an area of woodland, you've got not only got to create more to take into account the risk, but you've got to create more again because it's of the net gain. And at the moment, the government is saying it's going to be a 10% requirement for net gain. We'd love to see it higher than that, but there's been lots of developers pushing back against it, and we think it's going to be 10%. It is really expensive for developers, and because it's also 30 years worth of management is built into this. So the result is that developers are having to spend so much more money now on biodiversity than they did before. So clearly there are arguments against it, but we're, as a wildlife trust, we're very much in favour of having that process there instead of having nothing, if you like.
Probably point out at this point there, what Rachel's talking about there, this biodiversity net gain, that's coming in the Environment Bill. And so that isn't the planning reforms that we've just talked about, but obviously it happens sort of in parallel. The two systems are very interlinked. But yeah, we like that, but it's not in the planning reform necessarily, because it's a slightly different piece of legislation. So how can people get involved in a habitat survey? So I believe we've got some volunteers, don't we, Rachel, that go out and do this in addition to our staff. And obviously Rachel was saying there is potential to learn, but unfortunately with the pandemic at the moment, that does present a few challenges with educating people and helping people do that. So that might be something that happens a bit later on, further down the line. So the last question I'll take then, before explaining what we need to do, are any organisations joining in tackling the government on this one? Yes, there's lots of environmental charities involved. So with the Environment Bill in particular, we've got a coalition called Greener UK. Some of you may have heard of it and thought it's perhaps a different organisation, but what it actually is all the environmental charities, the big ones in the UK, coming together, like the RSPB, Woodland Trust, all the wildlife trusts, so many others as well. Campaigns Protect Rural England, those are just a few off the top of my head. So lots of us are all working on it together. I think we're probably the most prominent one in Cheshire and in the local area. But we sort of recognise that we do need to take a joined up approach, that us all talking about different things isn't how the government want to interact with us. Essentially, we all need to come from the same point of view. So planning in particular is one we've come together on as well. Interestingly, not just environmental charities, I think some housing charities as well have come on board as well. I know Shelter are part of this campaign as well, just because the affordability of housing is involved in that. So again, yeah, lots of organisations tackling it. So we're talking about lots of people coming together and acting for change. So I guess the only thing for me to tell you now is, what do we want you to do? So just to round off, if you'll go on, oops, no, I've gone a little bit too far there. Always do that. So what can you do? So what we want you to do is sign up to our campaign, essentially. And when we're saying sign up, there's 3 meaningful steps that you can do in this campaign. So when you sign up, you get the ability to respond to the consultation. So that's directly feeding into the government's sort of consultation there. We've got a pre-typed thing ready for you to send there. However, what I will say is, if you can add a personal comment, that's fantastic, because the government has said they want to hear personal comments. They don't really like organisations like us sending things to people to send on. So if you can add in your own thoughts as well, that would be brilliant. But don't feel you need to know everything about it, because it's all there as well. The second step in that process is email your councillor. So once you've done the first thing, the next thing that'll pop up is who your local councillors are. And again, we've got a pre-typed email there ready to go. But again, that personal touch just makes such a difference as well. So if you could add in your own thoughts, your comments as well, just to make your councillors aware of what's going on. And then the last step is tweet your MP. So once those 2 steps have come through, it'll automatically tell you who your MP is, link it to your Twitter account, and you'll be able to tweet your MP directly. And the point in this is that we want to try and influence everyone at different levels. So we want to respond to that government consultation. We want to get our local councils on board, and we want to get our local representatives on board as well. So by getting as many people involved as possible in that process, hopefully we can get some meaningful change. And I think it's really important to stress that it's not just you that can do it. Obviously, tell your friends, your family, your neighbours, everyone, get them on board with this as well, because the more people that respond, the more the government is going to listen on this one. And as I said, it's not come into law yet, so it's not too late to get changes at all. We can turn this around, and we just need your support. And if you can fight for some of the things that we've spoken about today, that would be amazing. So what I'd like to say is just thank you for attending. Thank you for listening to us and sending in all your questions. What will happen now is you'll get sent a link to this webinar with the recording. So if you want to watch anything back, you'll be able to see it and you can revisit it. We'll also send a link to this campaign sign up. But what I'll do now is we have a nice handy QR code for you. So if you've got a smartphone on you and you're happy to do it on your mobile phone, what you can do is sign up to the campaign straight away there, and you'll be able to start responding to the consultation. So you don't even have to wait. But like I said, if you're perhaps not too confident with QR codes and using it on your smartphone, we will email you a link as well. So don't worry about that. But yeah, thank you for listening to us today. And I hope that with everyone's support from here and across the country, we will get some real change for wildlife. So on behalf of Cheshire Wildlife Trust, thank you. And hopefully we'll see you at a webinar in the future soon.